Hello again. In today's lecture, we're going to look at Lawrence Stone's book, Family, Sex and Marriage in England, 1500 to 1800. And this is going to seem like an odd text to study in a course on the state. So I'm going to ask you to be a little patient, and we'll get to what this has to do with what we've been doing so far. So first of all, it's useful to try and recollect what the manorial system, the medieval manorial system operated like. Right? So this was common in Germany, France, and England, but the English manorial system is classic in its layout. Right? So first of all, a very hierarchical system, as you're probably aware. So you had the king. The king was sovereign. He had control over a territory, and the territory in turn was divided into estates, and the estates were controlled by mostly his family members and people who had legacies and people who might have been connected to him in some way and were considered more or less loyal to him. Right? And so the lords of these estates controlled vast lands, vast estates, and in turn they had vassals, knights who reported to them, who paid them some sort of tribute or a tax, one might say, and these people also had serfs and peasants working for them. The land itself was organized in this very hierarchical way, but there was the forest, the meadows, pasture lands, and fields. And fields, the fields belonged to the lord, or in some way, people had owed certain kinds of taxes or fees to the medieval lord. A great separation between the nobility and the peasantry was very evident around the time we're looking at, right? From about the early 1400s all the way through to the late 18th century. So we're going to look at two periods in England from Lawrence Stone's book. The first period is 1450 to 1630, and this is a period that he describes as the period characterized by the open lineage family. So let's take a quick look at what he means by this. So he starts with this epigraph, something from a later period from the Ladies' Magazine, which says, "The intent of matrimony is not for man and wife to be always taken up with each other, but jointly to discharge the duties of civil society, to govern their families with prudence and educate their children with discretion." Something that you might have heard in other contexts as well. So let's look at the first paragraph. Stone says, "The most striking characteristic of the late medieval and early 16th century family at all social levels was the degree to which it was open to external influences, a porosity that is in contrast to the more sealed off and private nuclear family type that was to develop in the 17th and 18th centuries. Not only its individual members, but the nuclear family itself was other directed. The principal external agencies varied from class to class, among the landed elite being mainly the kin and the good lord, and among the peasantry, artisans, and laborers being mainly the neighbors. In both cases, the nuclear family had only weak boundaries to separate it from the widest definitions of social space." So in other words, what Stone is saying is that you had a situation where families didn't have the kind of autonomy that you associate with a later period. Instead, they were completely other-directed, and kinship and lineage relationships, or what happened with neighbors, became far more important, right? So let's first look at, he spends a lot of time with the nobility and gentry, so let's look at that as well. In the late Middle Ages, the nuclear family of the landed elite was no more than a loose core at the center of a dense network of lineage and kin relationships. The degree to which kin interacted with the nuclear core depended on social rank. It was dominant among the great aristocracy, very influential among the squirarchy, and still more important among the parish gentry. So even among the nobility and the gentry, you have these gradations or these hierarchies. So you had, on the one hand, the lords, the great aristocracy, and the vassals, the squires, also important, and the parish or the church leaders, and the land, the estate owners at the local village level, also being, playing, having a similar type of relationship, or relationship to the lineage and kin. The reason for this is the preoccupation with the preservation, increase, and transmission through inheritance and marriage of the property and status of the lineage of the generations of ancestors stretching back into the remote past. The larger the property and status, and the more ancient the family on its ancestral acres, the more intense was the preoccupation with the lineage, and thus the greater the participation of the kin in the formation and daily life of the conjugal family. The degree of loyalty to the lineage thus depended on the size of the property and on the lack of social or geographical mobility. As a result, the conjugal family, among all ranks of the property classes, was inextricably enmeshed with and strongly supported by the kin. A great many of the functions now performed by the nuclear family and a great many of the emotions now focused upon it were then shared with the kin. Right? So, in contrast with how the nuclear family operates today in England in this period between the 15th and the 17th centuries, you have lineage and the kin, the extended family, one might say, playing a much larger role, especially among the gentry. Right? And why is this? This is because of the need to think about how inheritance and property relations were to continue and be preserved. The family at this period, therefore, cannot be looked at in isolation, since at every turn it was being affected by and interacting with kin relatives. So I was married into my husband's family, recalled Mary, Countess of Warwick, as late as the early 17th century, in a revealing phrase. Right? So this is something that that in many Indian contexts, especially among the upper classes, or one might say upper caste, upper social classes, you see the same kind of obsession, importance given to the extended family, the larger kin. Kinship was an institution whose purpose was the mutual economic, social, and psychological advancement of the group, and which the principle of patriarchy, the leadership of the head of the clan, was very strong, though tempered by the influence of the grand family council. Any such society, hierarchical, patriarchal, authoritarian, and kin-oriented, inevitably gives very low priority to the short-term quest for psychological or emotional gratification by the individual, and very high priority to the long-term economic and patronage interests of the lineage as a whole. So this is very important. And the rest of this chapter, what Stone is emphasizing repeatedly is, especially among the property classes, it becomes very important to maintain certain rules, certain structures, where individual autonomy, one might say, is far less important, not perhaps recognized, not even articulated as such, compared to the interests of the lineage as a whole. And this begins to decline in England in the late 16th century, lasted in Scotland until the late 17th. To understand the moral premises upon which such a society is based, it is necessary to rid ourselves of three modern, Western, culture-bound preconceptions. The first is that there is a clear dichotomy between marriage for interest, meaning money, status, or power, and marriage for affect, meaning love, friendship, or sexual attraction, and that the first is morally reprehensible. In practice, in the 16th century, no such distinction existed, right? And if it did, affect was of secondary importance to interest, while romantic love and lust were strongly condemned as ephemeral and irrational grounds for marriage. So relationships and marriage in particular formed around how to maintain certain property relations and certain lineage, right? And the second modern preconception, he says, is that sexual intercourse unaccompanied by an emotional relationship is immoral, and that marriage for interest is therefore a form of prostitution, right? So this is a way that one might understand, the exchange of women is for interests alone, for familial interests alone, is a form of prostitution, right? And the third is that personal autonomy, the pursuit by the individual of his or her own happiness, is paramount, a claim justified by the theory that it in fact contributes to the well-being of the group. So these are modern conceptions, and these conceptions simply didn't exist in England at that time. So, and he goes on to say that even a play such as Romeo and Juliet, when it was produced, it was not seen as a great tragedy because of a romance that couldn't be fulfilled, but rather a sort of a case of filial obedience and loyalty to the traditional friendships and enmities of the lineage. For an Elizabethan courtier, would be familiar enough with the bewitching passion of love to feel some sympathy for the young couple, but he would clearly see where duty lay. So duty lay in following filial obligations, right? And so that's the way in which, so the violation of norms was where the tragedy lay, right? So marriage among property-owning classes in 16th century England was therefore a collective decision of family and kin, not an individual one. So that's already been described as such. And the convention of primogeniture, what does that mean? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Really, the eldest born, the eldest son, not daughters, but the son, the eldest son, gets to inherit the wealth or the property of the father, right? So the other children, both daughters and younger sons, were at the economic mercy of their father or elder brother, who could allocate to them as much or as little as he chose of the personal estate in cash or life leases, right? So, except for the eldest son, everybody else had to rely on the largesse, on the generosity of the person who inherited, the person who actually controlled the property. So the prime factor affecting all families which own property was therefore the principle of primogeniture, for the preservation and protection of which the entail was designed. No study of the English landed family makes any sense unless the principle and practice of primogeniture is constantly borne in mind. So he goes on to describe all the ways in which younger and elder children oriented themselves around each other, etc., right? And so this idea of class endogamy. So women tended to marry spouses from similar economic brackets since only they were suitable recipients of a cash portion. So there was also a dowry associated with this. These are familiar themes in South Asia as well. So it's not difficult for us to grasp these concepts, right? So after 1660, laws were changed, and you had these settlement laws, which meant that even though even if you didn't inherit the land, there were you had a provision where everybody had a certain amount of guarantee. Every heir, or rather every child, could expect to have some portion of the property. So until 1660, this was younger children were at the mercy of their eldest brother, right, or the father. It should be emphasized that lineage and kinship was only one of three foci of loyalty for the greater and lesser landowners of the 15th and early 16th centuries. The second highly prized value was that of good lordship, a reciprocal exchange of patronage, support, and hospitality in return for attendance, deference, respect, and loyalty. Right? So the lordship, the lord of the manor, the person who controlled estates as far as the eye could see and beyond. Not just the lord himself, but the institution of lordship, which I shall try and explain in subsequent classes, if not in this class. This becomes very important when you try and understand sovereignty, it's not just the person who is vested with the crown or the title of an estate owner, right? The controller of the estate. It's also the institutions, the set of practices surrounding it that we have to pay attention to. Right? This lordship embraced not only the wider ramifications of the kin, but also the household retainers and servants, the client gentry, and the tenants on the estates, all comprising a collective affinity. The kin was therefore merely one component of this larger whole under which all the others were subsumed. Its physical manifestation was the great house with its open hospitality, its lack of privacy, and its constant crowds of attendants, retainers, servants, clients, and suitors. Its psychological manifestation was a particularist system of values by which only personalized loyalty and lordship was the highest and most prized of qualities, taking precedence over those of obedience to the Ten Commandments, of submission to the impersonal dictates of the law. Right? So even greater than paying attention to your Christian religion or to the law of the land, the deference to the personal authority of the king, it was this local connection to the Lord. It was a bounded, localized, highly personal world which had yet to be affected by wider notions of loyalty to more universalist codes and ideals. Right. So I'm going to skip across some of these themes, but I hope, since I've handed this to you, I hope you'd have a chance to read these sections. So primogeniture and patriarchy meant that power tended to drift into the hands of the oldest males. So this becomes very important, right? And that in every family, village, and country, and even at court, there was a constant struggle to win the approval of and establish some reciprocal claim upon some individual, often an old man, who controlled the levers of power. In such a society, marriage with its attendant family settlement was a critical ingredient for the extension of the network of patronage connections, and was therefore strictly controlled by the elders of both families. And then a third characteristic, he says, was this idea of honor, and this it arose out of medieval ideas of chivalry, and it demanded public recognition of individual worth. So people, so you might be familiar with the Hindi phrase "izzat ka sawal." So these are parallels, but not identical terms, right? This idea of personal honor, that your dignity shall not be trampled upon. These are all the sorts of medieval ideas that were very important. What is significant about these three interlocking sets of values is that they all took priority over both loyalty and to the nuclear family unit against the outside world, over obedience to the sovereign state, right? So the good lordship, this very localized but tight network was very important, right? So in contrast, he talks about the plebs. The plebs are the working people, the peasants and the serfs. And for them, they were in some senses freed of these kinds of obligations, right? They were poor, no doubt. They had great difficulty in terms of how they would, conduct their daily lives. But they also didn't have the kinds of obligations. They didn't have property to hand over to their children. And they were in a sense a little more mobile sometimes, but conditions were markedly different. And I urge you to look at how these different relationships are described. Marriage among the poor, we must assume, was far more personal than a family and kin affair, right? In contrast to what was going on with with the gentry. By the end of the 17th century, Stone is saying that things changed dramatically, right? I won't read out this epigraph, you should read it yourself, but from the introduction, it says, between about 1500 and 1700, the English family structure at the upper levels began a slow process of evolution in two related ways. Firstly, the importance of the nuclear core increased, not as a unit of habitation, but as a state of mind, as its boundaries became more clearly defined, so the influence of kin and clientage correspondingly declined. Secondly, the importance of affective bonds. Affective bonds are bonds of sentiment, bonds of emotion, and so on, of affect, to tie the conjugal unit together began to increase. These two changes were the product of three concurrent and interrelated changes: the decline of kinship and clientage as the main organizing principles of landed society, the rise of the powers and claims of the state, encouraged by the Protestant reformers, both taking over some of the economic and social functions previously carried out by the family, kin and the clientage, and subordinating kin and client loyalties to the higher obligations of patriotism and obedience to the sovereign, and the missionary success of Protestantism, especially its Puritan wing, in bringing Christian morality to a majority of homes, especially among the gentry and urban bourgeoisie, both in sanctifying holy matrimony and in making the family serve as a partial substitute for the parish. So there's a lot of ideas that are compressed in here, but effectively what Stone is saying is you had these much larger changes taking place at the level of the English state, right? And the church, right? You see changes to the church structure. You've also seen the Reformation, the rise of Protestantism. Of course, you have with Henry VIII, the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church itself influenced a great deal by Protestantism. So those changes, along with changes in the organization of the state itself, become very important in shifting, things happening at a much smaller scale, at the scale of the family. And so it's important to sort of try and understand how these shifts are taking place. And this is also a way to understand what we conventionally might think about the relationships between state and society. Right? This is an idea that is recurrent But as we shall also see, it's a problematic kind of assumption to make this kind of separation between something called the state and something called society. And this book by Stone is one of very interesting ways in which we can discover empirically how these distinctions between the state and society are not so large after all, right? So he says, at the same time, these and other forces were at work to bring about a third important development, the reinforcement for a time among these social groups of the pre-existing patriarchal aspects of internal power relationships within the family. So the patriarchal relationships that you see in lineage society, right? The kind of way where kinship was important and so on, that doesn't disappear, even as the nuclear family starts to become more important. And a large part of it has to do with the way in which the state now reorganizes or re-emphasizes the role of patriarchal relationships. So we'll see how this works. This occurred partly because the nuclear family became more free from interference by the kin, especially the wife's kin, and partly because of wider religious, legal, and political changes which enhanced the powers of the head of the household. The period is therefore one in which two overlapping family types can be seen to coexist among the upper and middle ranks, each slowly but imperfectly replacing the other. The first was the late medieval open lineage family, exposed to influence from kinship and clientage, in which the conjugal unit of husband, wife, and unmarried children was of relatively lesser importance than the wider kinship affiliation of the cousinhood and even of the wider attachments of the good lordship. The second was the restricted patriarchal nuclear family of the late 16th century, in which loyalty became increasingly focused inward on the conjugal core and outward on the state, rather than on kin relatives by blood or marriage, right? So suddenly you have these units, not kin, not family, not the lordship, but the state that becomes an important source, an important focus of loyalty, right? So let's try and understand how this appears. And he says, kinship connections certainly continue to be important for many purposes, especially economic job aid and job placement, but they were increasingly limited to the closer relatives, right? So instead of having these large extended families and where lineage was important in all sorts of complex ways, you had uncles and aunts, fathers-in-law, brothers-in-law, and sons-in-law who were called upon to serve surrogate or interchangeable roles within members of the nuclear family. So you have a sort of a more confined notion of family and kin. I'm going to again move forward because there's a lot of detail here which is important, which I would hope that you would read. But in national politics, there took place a slow decline, first in kinship, then in clientage, as the central organizing principle of political groupings. In the 15th century, the Wars of the Roses were almost entirely a struggle of aristocratic kinship factions and alliances for control of royal authority and patronage. Right? I think the War of the Roses was between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Right? So great battles across huge aristocratic lordly families. In the 16th century, kin groupings remained powerful in politics, but slowly gave way to religious conviction and personal ambition as the state strengthened its grip on society and began to attract loyalties to itself. Even so, much of the political infighting of the century revolved around certain kinship rivalries, in particular between the Howards and the Dudleys, until the last illegitimate Dudley finally went into exile at the end of the century. The Howards hitched themselves onto King James I's coattails to share in the spoils of the court. It has been shown conclusively that clientage was a primary cement of political faction in the earlier Elizabethan period, but its influence was much weakened in the early 17th century because of the emergence of fundamental issues of religious and constitutional principle and the distribution of the burden of taxation. So you see this central authority of the court becoming, trying to consolidate its power in all sorts of ways, and alongside a whole series of other developments, this family structure also shifting, and clientage and family loyalties becoming subordinate to the principle of autonomy of choice of political and religious ideology. This became clear during the English Revolution of the 1640s, when one aristocratic family in 7 was divided father against child or brother against brother, right? So the emergence of Protestantism is also a very important part of this development. And for those of you who remember Max Weber, and the spirit of capitalism, Protestantism and the spirit of capitalism, you would remember or you would recognize some of the same signs taking place in this period. Other loyalties now took precedence among the elite of the English political nation, although how far this change penetrated down the society is at present unknown. Right? So kinship was eroding in the 17th century, and there's all sorts of ways in which this happened, in contrast to what was happening in Scotland, where kinship was still quite high for a long period. Right? The role of kinship also kind of complicated by the fact that there were too many connections. If everybody was everybody's else's cousin, then the connections doesn't really matter that much, right? So that's also the reason why kinship as a source of political strength began to decline in this period. To conclude, he says, everything points to a very slow erosion of the significance of kinship ties among the landed classes, but there is also good reason to suppose that they persisted and continue to play a part in family strategy and local and national politics well into the 19th century. A slow trend should not be mistaken for radical change. Moreover, with the decline of ideological passion in national politics after 1720, there was a positive revival of the power of patronage networks and clientage until ideological conflict rose again towards the end of the century. Right? So these were, in a sense, contingent on other developments taking place, but one shouldn't make too much of this break. Shouldn't sort of treat this as a big rupture in social relationships, but rather as a slow change that kind of had some certain reversals as well during certain periods. Now, he then goes on to talk about the middle ranks, having talked about the aristocracy, talks about the middle ranks. I'm going to skip this portion because I want to move on to a later part of this chapter, where he talks about the causes of change, and he says there were political reasons for this change, and it has already been noticed that the strength of kinship and clientage ties is correlated with the existence of hard times, which for the upper classes takes down the last part of what I want to emphasize is from his chapter 5 on the reinforcement of patriarchy. Right? The last part of what I want to re-emphasize is his chapter 5, the reinforcement of patriarchy. So let's take a look at this epigraph. If ever thou purpose to be a good wife and to live comfortably, set down this with thyself. Mine husband is my superior, my better. He hath authority and rule over me. Nature hath giveth it to him. God hath given it to him. Right. So this is clearly something that would make contemporary. So the last part I want to emphasize is last part I want to describe in today's class is the section from chapter 5, which is on the reinforcement of patriarchy. Right? I'm not going to read this epigraph, but you will find it relevant. And here he says what is happening by the 17th century is a major shift, a shift in the nuclear family, and the importance of the enhancement of the importance of the. Finally, we come to this part of the book, which is still, early on in the book. He's talking about the 17th century, page 185 out of the 860 pages. It's a rather large book, as you can tell. But this is on the reinforcement of patriarchy. Right? I'm not going to read this epigraph. You will find it interesting, no doubt. But let me read the first paragraph again. The enhancement of the importance of the conjugal family and the household relative to the kinship and clientage at the upper levels of society was accompanied by a positive reinforcement of the despotic authority of the husband and father, that is to say, of patriarchy. Both church and state provided powerful new theoretical and practical support, while two external checks on patriarchal power declined as kinship ties and clientage weakened. At the same time, a new interest in children, coupled with the Calvinist premise of original sin, gave fathers an added incentive to ensure the internalized submissiveness of their children. It cannot be proved conclusively that in reality the powers of father over children and of husbands over wives in the upper and middle ranks most exposed to this propaganda became greater than they had been in the Middle Ages, right? But this seems a plausible hypothesis, given the fact that patriarchy, for its effective exercise, depends not so much on raw power or legal authority as on the recognition of all concerned of its legitimacy, hallowed by ancient tradition, moral theology, and political theory. So we'll come to this theme repeatedly, not just in this course, but throughout your studies in the social sciences, anywhere where power is concerned. Namely, that it's not just the danda, it's not just the stick, it's not just coercion that is important in the application of political power. It is also the formation of consent, the formation of some kind of acceptance, forms of speech that accompany these types of acceptance. That becomes extremely important in reproducing these structures of power. Willing acceptance of the legitimacy of the authority together with the weakness of competing foci of power are the keys to the whole system. So we come to the state. So the parallel between the state and the patriarchal family becomes very important because it sort of one reinforces the other. Right? So it has been plausibly argued that patriarchy within the family is a characteristic of societies with strong authoritarian state systems, a phase of development characteristic of 16th and early 17th century England, between the more simple semi-tribal feudal or community organizations of medieval society and the participatory limited monarchy and later mass democracy of the late 17th century onwards. The question of deciding which is the cause and which is the effect is irrelevant, since authoritarian monarchy and domestic patriarchy form a congruent and mutually supportive complex of ideas and social systems. The growth of patriarchy was deliberately encouraged by the new Renaissance state on the traditional grounds that the subordination of the family to its head is analogous to and also a direct contributory cause of subordination of subjects to the sovereign. Right? In other words, you say, well, having this patriarchal family with a singular head is a way of training subjects to be obedient to their king. In 1609, James I informed his somewhat dubious subjects that, quote, the state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth, end quote. One of his arguments being that, quote, kings are compared to fathers and families, for a king is truly parens patriae, the politic father of his people, end quote. When some 25 years later, Robert Filmer argued the case for absolute monarchy, he used exactly the same logic, right? So this goes on and on. So this idea that the family, the patriarchal family and the paternalist state are the same thing. In France, the old lines of arguments were, if possible, made even more explicit. In 1639, a royal declaration stated the natural respect of children towards their parents is the bond of the legitimate obedience of the subjects towards their sovereigns, end quote. Right? So there are good reasons to think that the support given by the state to the principle of patriarchy paid off in generating an internalized sense of obligation, of obedience to the absolute king as the father of his people. And so there's a lot more that there's a lot more that one can say about the relationship between patriarchy and kingship and a strong state more generally. Right? So I'm going to skip some parts here, but clearly you can now see why, thinking about the state and thinking about the transformation of the family become relevant. They're related to each other. Right? Thinking about the two together is not such an absurd thing after all. There were changes in the law, right? And the changes in the law that are most relevant to the structures of family life have to do with inheritance again. So a change in legal arrangements for the inheritance of property, which in origin probably had nothing to do with the motives of either church or state, nonetheless powerfully reinforced the trend to patriarchy within the nuclear family. During the Middle Ages, control of the landed property through the entail meant that the head of the family was no more than a life tenant of most of the estates, with little freedom to dispose of them at his pleasure. In the late 15th century, the lawyers found a way to break entails without too much difficulty, and some confusing legislation of the 1530s had the result of still further widening the breach. This greatly strengthened the ability of the current head of the family to dispose of the property as he chose, although it also greatly weakened his capacity to prevent his heir from doing the same thing. He could now quite easily either sell land to meet current needs or split it up amongst his children as he thought fit. The increase in his freedom of action, the current owner, meant an increase in his capacity to punish or reward his children or siblings. This meant the further subordination of the children, including the heir, to the father, or the younger sons and daughters to their elder brother, if he inherited the estate before they married. So all of these dynamics, all of these family dynamics were in a sense only strengthening patriarchal relationships, right? So I'm again going to skip through a lot of this material. Education, again, so technological transformations and external change, including the burgeoning trade that was taking place with the East Asia and, sorry, not just East Asia, all of Asia, and particularly India and Indonesia and the East Indies, and also the beginnings of the slave trade in the 17th century, and its proliferation really in the 18th century, also transforming social life. So we haven't come to that period yet, but Stone does talk about that in due course. And yet, but already you have other shifts as well. The invention of the printing press, the distribution of books, the emphasis laid on the book, that is the Bible, as a repository of all wisdom, inevitably had the effect of widening the social and cultural gap between those who could read, especially those who could read Latin, and those who could not. Although the mid-16th century saw the emergence of a number of highly educated noble women, in general, access to both sacred truth and to new learning was monopolized by men, thus increasing their prestige and influence and reducing that of women. In Elizabethan England, this discrepancy between the sexes in terms of education was true of all levels of society, from the male artisans who could sign their names to the male elite who could write letters and read the Bible, and often also Cicero. Most of their wives were unable to emulate their husbands in these respects, which significantly reinforced their sense of inferiority. To sum up, the power of the husband and father was greatly enhanced by his inheritance from the pre-Reformation priest of the duty to indoctrinate his family in piety and morality through daily family prayers and Bible reading. He was relieved of some of his social responsibilities by the state, but strongly encouraged by it to exercise his delegated authority as the priest ruler of his microcosmic empire. He was given greater power over family property, including that of his wife or his children, and enjoyed considerable freedom to exercise physical coercion backed by the full force of law and custom. He was more free than ever before from control and guidance from his own or his wife's kin, and to a considerable extent from interference by the parish priest. As a result, the husband and father for a time being became the family despot, benevolent or malign, according to temperament and inclination, lording it over his wife and his children. Almost the only check left upon his will was now the moral consensus of friends and neighbors, themselves also deeply affected by these patriarchal values. But this mostly affected the plebs, and community feeling, as expressed in violent public acts against domineering wives, was on the whole supportive of patriarchy. So already you're starting to see a shift from the previous period to this period, from the lineage society where the plebs, including women, had a little more freedom than the aristocracy. Now, these values and patriarchal conditions, so also transforming the plebs, right? It should be emphasized, however, that the common practice of fostering out and the high level of geographical mobility caused by the social custom and by economic dislocations meant that among the poor, the control of the father over his children was limited to the relatively short period before they left home. After this point, patriarchal authority over them was exercised not by their natural father, but by the master, whose living-in servants or apprentices they became. Thus, among the lower classes, the patriarchal principle and the practice remained powerful, but was exercised mainly upon the children of other people after they had reached the age of about 10 to 14. Right? So I'm going to stop over here, but I hope I have conveyed in this lecture to you this strange relationship, the formative relationship between family structure, family life, and the emerging, shifting role of the state in England during a very important period in global history, not just English history, but one should really say global history. Recall also how England was becoming more powerful during this period, and certainly by the end of the or rather the beginning of the 18th century, the end of this period, things have changed quite dramatically in the world as a whole.